my purpose, I think, of doing this is I like to inform as well as entertain. So that's what part of our goal tonight, to maybe enlighten you a little bit, make you laugh a little bit. We'll see. To start with, I'm a member of the Friends Committee here at the Arbutus Library, so I'm not the usual scholar or author who usually speaks to you. Let me tell you how I got here tonight. I had surgery right after our January blizzard, so I missed our committee meeting in February. And you know what they say, when you don't show up at a meeting, you get nominated for something. So here I am. But actually, I've had a lifelong love affair with history, and have always been curious about where I grew up. I call the talk Lansdowne, the Lost Village, because in many ways I feel that my community has been lost to time. Books have been written on Arbutus and Catonsville, and thanks to the efforts of Mr. Ray Chisholm, we know the history of Relay. But I bet not many of you here know much about the history of Lansdowne. But the neglect of Lansdowne, which it has experienced over the years, really hasn't been all that bad. We've had no development. So many of the old community buildings and lovely old 19th century, 20th century homes still exist. And for some people, it still possesses the feel of the semi-rural community that it once was. I was thrilled when last summer I heard that a group was meeting at the Lansdowne Inn to talk about local history. I went to that meeting and have been involved with the project ever since. The person who founded that project is here with me tonight, filmmaker Diane Cosgrove, and Ranke, his family name. And I would like him to tell you why he initiated the project. Dan? Yes, Dan, your turn. Just to give the background. How it started.
I wanted to keep myself out of trouble. Why did I start this project? If you go to our website, I wrote this story on the first page how I started the project. But basically, I was working on a private DVD, a private film for my mother's side of the family about my grandparents, Paul and Catherine Ranke. And I happened to be in the Lansdowne Inn one night, and in passing, I told this to one of the waitresses, and I said that, some of my family's history could be repurposed to tell some of the history of the community. Well, she got confused and thought I said I was making a film about the history of Lansdowne. She started telling people, and several people came up to me and said, "Oh, I hear you're making a film about the history of Lansdowne." I'm like, "I am." And one of the ladies that heard this, she came up to me in the inn, and she said, "I heard you're making a film about the history of Lansdowne," and I was like, "Well, I don't know about that." And she said, "Well, I know the Baltimore County Public Library has historical photos of Lansdowne. Let me get your contact information. I'll forward it, and they'll send you what they have." So 2 days later, somebody did contact me from the library, and I guess it was from Arbutus, and they sent me a link, and they did in fact have a lot of historical photographs of Lansdowne. I took a look at them, and I said, "Well, they're kind of interesting." So I started just engaging the energy around me about possibly making a film about the history of Lansdowne. And I just started asking some questions to some people, getting a few things. The first big organization I contacted was the Lansdowne Volunteer Fire Department, and they, fortunately for the community, they recorded a lot of their history. So they had a lot of stuff. And then the first person I contacted was Mary Barr, who had a lot of family history, and her family goes back in the Lansdowne, how many generations? From the Foxes. Her great-grandfather, John A. Fox, was Lansdowne's first resident postmaster. My grandfather, Paul Ranke, was Lansdowne's last resident postmaster. So between what she had, what I had, some things we could find out, we started putting that history together. But between what the fire department had and what Mary had, there was a lot of information that could be put together. Started telling the story about the community, so we started. I started putting it together. Then the owner of the Lansdowne Inn, George, suggested we started having meetings up there so that people in the community would come up. They would bring the historical information they had from their families, and all that worked like a charm. And it was like a snowball going down a hill. So we've created a website. The website has more than 3 hours of video about the history of the community and more than 300 photographs. And the project's not done, but a lot of the history is on the website now. What we're doing in 2016 is capturing what's going on today for future generations. So, did that answer the question?
Sounds good, Dan.
Well, first and foremost, I needed something to keep myself out of trouble, so.
Thank you. Tonight, we will present history in what we feel is a 21st century approach. I will present some information and commentary, but there will be one other speaker, Mary, but most of our presentation will be done by video. Let us begin. In the early 1800s, iron ore was discovered in the Lansdowne area. In the 1830s, the local iron ore industry boomed. An English firm, the Whittaker Iron Company, was the prominent player. Also, on March 5th, 1838, a Pennsylvania mining engineer by the name of Rosby Carr bought the land from Minebank Lane to Smith Avenue, where I live. The area was known, of course, as Carrsville in his honor. Iron ore was transported by mule carts to the iron furnaces at Elk Ridge Landing, then a busy port. Mining continued for about another 20 years, and the mining also changed the topography of the area because earth from the pits was moved to form hills, and when sometimes they were working in the mining pits, underground springs emerged, and in one lake they had to abandon mining equipment, which we think is still at the bottom, and that was Luchenbiel's Lake, which is now near what they call Lake in the Woods. And also the Great Flood of 1868 helped to fill up the mine pits and make many of the lakes that did exist, and still a few exist in Lansdowne today. The land that would become part of today's Lansdowne was sold by Rosby Carr to Matthias Linthicum in 1857. This was the land between 1st Avenue and 5th Avenue. Also, as early as the 1850 census, Wesley B. Coursey farmed along the Columbia Pike, now the Washington Boulevard. We have a video about the Coursey family cemetery. Dan? And in the video with me, and I asked him to come tonight, but apparently he's not here, was Mr. Ron Hurd, who he and his twin brother live in Arbutus, and they are direct descendants of the Courseys. So they haven't moved very far in almost 200 years, and that the two of them are still close by. All right, on March 23rd, 1889, the Linthicum family sold the land between 1st and 5th Avenues, then was called Brunswick, to a Mr. Samuel Crothers. Crothers took out a mortgage of $40,000 for 428 lots. He partnered with an Irishman named McGrath. McGrath's job was to promote the development of the village. He spent 6 years on the project. He named the business the Lansdowne Real Estate Company in honor of Dublin-born Sir William Petty, whose titles included Earl of Shelbourne and the Marquis of Lansdowne. As Prime Minister of England, he negotiated the peace with the new United States in 1783. Mr. McGrath promoted the development of Lansdowne by standing on a corner in Baltimore City, we think somewhere near Camden Station, and gave out free tickets for rides on the B&O train to Lansdowne so people could see the village. He said the land was, and I quote, near to railroad transportation, scenic, free of malaria, and had clear, pure air. And in 1890, Charles W. Hull developed the community of Joshua. And so now we want to show something about Mr. Hull. Mary Barr, who works as the curator, right, and the archivist of Elk Ridge Heritage, who will speak to you about her father, and will continue with several videos after that, some of them of which are her father's reminiscences, and it's actually his voices on the video.
The Lansdowne connection of my dad's history begins with two short backstories, starting with a generation of his maternal grandparents. His grandfather was John August Fox, a Union veteran, who married Christina Zune, a florist. Now, can we have a picture of them? Part of their history is that they had the first congregational meetings of what is now Our Savior's Lutheran Church in their home, which home was also a community post office, and in which he was the postmaster, as you have seen before. In another segment, and in my dad's own narrative, and perhaps showing John August in uniform, he touches on John's ethics and values regarding war, like his refusal to collect his military benefits for his time spent guiding a mule-driven munitions wagon at Antietam, because he thought it was blood money, and that John A.'s sole reason for participating in the Civil War was to free slaves. The next generation from my bar grandparents were the two boys, Maurice John, the oldest, and in the automotive repairing business, and my dad, who in his youth was an active participant and board member in the same church, deriving from my Fox great-grandparents' home meetings, and that was the Lutheran church that you saw, Lutheran Church of Our Savior. Another video contains images of my dad painting, as well as the paintings he painted for and of Our Savior's Lutheran Church, such as Jesus at Gethsemane above the altar, the boy Samuel, and Jesus and the children. May be shown or not are the interpretive illustrations for the 23rd Psalm of David, published in 1936. Now, stopping right here, that is Elizabeth Avenue, painted by my dad. Now, in showcasing one's history, no one's life is just a list of mere accomplishments. What my dad left behind was about his life, not only to be remembered, but to be a signpost for others along the way, should they look. For those who didn't know him personally, I add, with his good parental upbringing, respect for life, and having faith, my dad's best success I can describe is his living like a living painting himself. For Dad's sensitive and caring influence on others far exceeded, in the long run, the brightening of any wall with a canvas. I look forward to more fun now that even a fragment of the large family history I maintain, research, and organize was valued useful beyond their files and binders to document a small segment of Lansdowne's larger history. Chickens have a way of coming home to roost. Behind a mystical curtain, I think my dad is in cahoots with the whole project.
When I was still a small boy, near where the Lansdowne Library is today, my father would pick cherries off of trees there on 3rd Avenue to make cherry wine. So there were still cherry trees in the 1960s in Lansdowne. So you see still some of that small town feel there. But now I'd like to bring on someone we just saw briefly. I want to get a few minutes into an interview with her, Dr. Edna Mae Merson, who she will explain a little bit in the video, I think the part we see, that her family was the Link family, which she says owned half of Arbutus at one time. And she was the youngest principal in Baltimore County system when she was made a principal, and she was the principal at that time of Arbutus Elementary School. So we have the first 3 minutes of that interview. Well, thank you again for coming. There's some drinks here and the 50-50. Let Mary draw. Who's going to be our winner tonight?